right? Make them agree, even when they don't necessarily seem to, right? For them, this is a fact. It really is, right? And I'm not here, and I need you to know this, right? And I could have said it about any one of the traditions. In fact, I think I did. First day, I said, I'm not here to preach one religion over another, right? No. What I really want to do is apply the same kind of scrutiny to this religious tradition that I have to the others. This one I know in more detail, right? You could do exactly the same thing, and scholars do, with the Buddha. How do we know who he was? What are the sources? How reliable are they, and why? Always some gray area, but what you can see if you study the work of scholars over the decades, that some clarity really begins to come out, right, about what might be true. True in the sense in which we in the West insist upon it. Historical accuracy, right? When Buddhists look at fundamentalists in other religious traditions, perhaps even in their own, they're just flummoxed by this whole insistence on it's got to be factual, right? It's got to be true. Because if it's not, if one thing in these teachings is wrong, the whole thing blows up. Well, that's kind of strict, don't you think? There doesn't seem to be any room for play, right? Where's the new revelation going to come from when you already have it, when it's just carved in stone, man? Where does the new, how do we meet the divine if it has to be just this way? Well, 4 Gospels. I can tell you what scholars have found. As far as we can tell, and again, we're talking about a consensus among biblical scholars, Mark is the earliest gospel. It's the shortest one. It's the quickest one. It just gets in there and gets out, right? John is the latest one. Matthew and Mark in between. Mark written, as far as we can tell, sometime around between 60 and 70 CE. Now think about that for a moment, 60 and 70 CE. When did Jesus die?
28 CE.
Well, you're both right or not. We don't really know. We're not sure when he was born. Okay, newsflash, he wasn't born at the stroke of midnight on December the 25th of the year. Would it be 1 or 0? I'm not sure which. No. We're not really sure, right? So, that's kind of weird to think, isn't it? This might not be 2014. We might still be partying like it's 1999. We just don't know it. Well, okay. So let's, maybe 6 years, give or take, right? So let's just say that Jesus dies in the year 30, okay, for the sake of argument, in the year 30. Mark's Gospel, the earliest account of the life, death of Jesus, 30 years later, at least. 30 years. What was happening 30 years ago? 30 years ago. What it was? 1984? Well, I was a lot younger. I don't know about you. Okay, Reagan is president. All right, let's go with this, okay? If someone were writing about Reagan's presidency during his presidency, do you think they might write it a little differently than if they were writing about Reagan's presidency now? Given all the water that's gone under the bridge in the meantime, right? I think so. 30 years. Well, wait a minute. What, did Mark just go, I remember, I better sit down and write this down? How did those stories survive in the meantime? That's what I want to know. 30 years. Oral tradition, right? That's the way it works. Oral tradition. Mark finally, whoever he was, right, sits down, writes this book, but you can tell that he's drawing from other sources. Right? In fact, you can tell even more so with Matthew and Luke. Because if you look at Matthew and Luke, what you will find is almost the entire Gospel of Mark appears in both of those Gospels. Are they guilty of plagiarism? No. The ancient world, very common practice, right? almost the entire Gospel of Mark shows up. Now, what does that tell you about Matthew and Luke? Apparently, they had Mark's Gospel. I mean, much of it is word for word. So apparently, Mark is a source, a historical source, for Matthew and Luke. Here's the kicker. All right, we got 3 out of 4. John. John's Gospel is radically different. Apparently, he didn't have Mark. If he did, he didn't use it. Right? He has other sources, and he has a very different view of who Jesus was. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus still seems to be human. I mean, you see him doing human things, right? Now, Mark's gospel is in such a hurry, either he didn't use or he didn't have any sources for the birth of Jesus. Maybe those stories hadn't really become popular yet, right? You don't get anything. He shows up around 30 years old, boom, right? Starts preaching after he gets baptized. Dunked, thank you. No. It's in Matthew and Luke that you begin to get those marvelous, right, those mythical stories, from my childhood about Jesus being born. Okay? What is the very first verse of the Gospel of John? The very first verse of the Gospel. I want you to listen to how different this sounds, okay? In the beginning was what? A tiny little baby child? No, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and here we go. The Word was God. From the beginning, in John's Gospel, Jesus is already divine. We have stepped outside the Jewish world, where humans are humans and God is God. I was not taught that in my church. They all link up perfectly, which is one way of reading it, right? But there are other ways as well. And that whole oral tradition thing makes me a little nervous. Have you ever played the game telephone or pass it on? You know what I'm talking about? If I was to tell you a story and you tell him, it goes all the way around the room. By the time he gets back to me, what's happened to it? Oh, good Lord. Forget about it, right? Now, I say that oral tradition tends to be more flexible, say, than written tradition. But I want to give a couple of provisos, right? One is that in the ancient world, people were a lot better about remembering stuff. Because for one thing, they couldn't carry around that little magic picture box that everybody has in their pockets, right? No virtual memory, right? You remembered more. It's one of the reasons stories were so popular. The other thing, too, and this Ehrman taught me because it is his area of specialty, just because there's a written tradition doesn't mean there's not still some flexibility and evolution of the tradition itself. Because Ehrman looks at, and he showed us in class, some of the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels. Now, none of them are originals, not even close, right? Not centuries later, those are the earliest fragments that we have, right? And you can see if you read Greek, you can see the differences even in the same gospel. That the tradition is growing and changing and evolving as traditions do. Look at Buddhism. Look at every one of these religious traditions and you'll find the same thing. You'll also find some people in those traditions who are okay with that, and you will find some people in those traditions who say, absolutely, that cannot be the case. Because they have certain beliefs about it, yeah.
When was John written?
As far as we know, if Mark was written around 60 to 70, John 90 CE, towards the end of the first century.
Oh, okay, so it's 30 years.
30 years, give or take. And you have to wonder if that is one of the reasons why John's gospel is so different. 30 more years of this tradition being passed along and growing, and people's understanding of who Jesus was or might have been evolving. Plus, the movement is spreading outside of its original Jewish context. And now it's intermingling with that broader context, the Roman Empire, where this Greek culture, the Romans took over for the Greeks, right? the process of Hellenization has pretty much taken place, right? Where, again, the Greek language is widespread and Greek thinking is widespread. If you know anything about Alexander the great Greek general, every place that guy went, well, first of all, he kicked butt, si vous pardonnerez mon français, and secondly, he took Greek culture with him, right? The Greek arts, Greek schools, Greek thinking. And it actually shows up right here in the New Testament. In the New Testament. Another thing that needs to be taken into consideration is the way that stories are told. I don't know about you, but I'm guessing there's a joke that you know that you might tell your best friend in one way, but you might tell your mama in a very different way. It depends on your audience, right? It depends on your audience. It also depends on your purpose. What are you looking to do with this story that you were telling? And as I say, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you do get some sense of a historical human being, but John tells you right up front, these things I write, what? To give you historical information centuries later? That you might believe. That you might believe, right? He is owning his, well, and I don't mean this in a bad way, don't take me wrong, his bias, right? His slant. This is why I am writing this, right? Not to be completely objective, but for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose, as he said from the get-go, is to convince you that Jesus is not just a man, but he's a God.
His audience changed, though, because the Jews had been dispersed in years. So they were not the targeted audience that the other three Gospels.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, the audience changes as that first century progresses, and even more in the second and third centuries. That is another element of what is going on here. You have to take into consideration your audience, right? Your audience. And you're going to speak to different groups different ways. John, obviously, in a more Greek context, if you will. The very fact that the New Testament is not written in the language of the people it is about, but in a different language. Have you learned a second language? It's really not just a matter of this word means that, is it? Think about the cultural differences. All of that comes into play. And it makes this a rather complex phenomenon. And I just really want us to appreciate that because, again, as a young person, I didn't hear a lot of complexity. It was all simple and black and white and the truth with a capital T. And if you question... Is he speaking about a different person? John from Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Historically speaking? I think they are talking about the same person, right? The question is, it seems to me that by the time John's gospel gets written, he's no longer just a person. He's become this other thing, this other being, right? This God-man, this God-man. Are there glimpses of that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Absolutely, absolutely. Where does that come from? Well, okay, thank you. Isaiah, yes. Is that a Jewish interpretation of Isaiah, though? No, it's not, right? No, it's not. That is a Christian interpretation of Isaiah. We talked about prophets and prophesying last time, didn't we? Here's where it comes. Holy cow. Time flies when you're having fun. Yes. This is where Paul comes in. If you look at Jesus in his context, was Jesus from Jerusalem? No, he's from Mebane. Right? He's a small town boy. Yes, right? Who hit the big time, if you will, right? There's no indication that he understood Greek, that he thought in Greek terms, right? Just a local boy. Paul, Jerusalem, well educated, new